Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Wong, Associate Professor at the School of Architecture here at UNC Charlotte, or I guess our new name is just plain Charlotte. Um, thank you all for joining us for our third lecture of this 50th anniversary year for the School of Architecture. Katie Zhang is with us, also the co-coordinator for the lecture series. And I think we'll just get started. Today, our special guest is Sylvia Levin, who is currently the professor of architecture at Princeton University and was a director of the critical studies MA and PhD programs in the Department of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA, where she was chairperson for 10 years from 1996 to 2006. Ms. Levin is a critic, curator, historian, and theorist whose work explores the limits of architecture across a wide spectrum of historical periods. She received her PhD from the Department of Art and Archaeology at Columbia University. Her first published texts include Quatre de Kant and the Invention of Modern Language of Architecture. And one of my personal favorites, Form Follows Libido, Architecture and Richard Neutra in a Psychoanalytic Culture, both released by the MIT Press. More recent books include Architecture Itself and Other Postmodern Effects, Kissing Architecture, and also one of my favorites, Flash in the Pan. Of note is Ms. Levin's role as an active curator, and I stress the word curator, of architecture and design, with exhibits including Architecture Itself and Other Postmodern Myths, displayed at the Canadian Center for Architecture in 2018, and Everything Loose Will Land, 1970s Art and Architecture in Los Angeles, which was exhibited at a number of places, exhibited at the Schindler House, the Graham Foundation in Chicago, and the Yale School of Architecture. She is the recipient of an Arts and Letters Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and is currently working on a book about trees, which will be the subject of her talk to us this afternoon, as you may have guessed from the title of the lecture. It's nice, Sylvia, in the kind of introductions before we open it up on Zoom here, apologize for saying this is a kind of trial run of this particular theme regarding trees and arboretums. And I think the last time you were here, Sylvia, you were also playing with a kind of little postmodern research study, which you were also testing out on us. So we're very happy to get the kind of front edge of the bow of the ship. So thank you very much for coming. So take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for your gracious introduction and invitation. And I'm really sorry not to be there with you in person. I have to say I was looking forward to coming back to your neck of the woods and having a little bit more Vietnamese food with you all. So I'm glad to be there in this manner. And because you're celebrating your 50th birthday, I'm going to spend my time talking about a project that is more or less 50 years old. And had it been built in southern Georgia, it might have been a neighbor that would have been interesting for you all to see. And maybe once I'm done, it will entice you to go see where it was not built, which I think also has some interest. Okay, so I am going to do this share screen window thing. Hang on just a second. Share. Okay, Greer, am I good? Thank you. I see a nice thumbs up. Okay, so over the course of what has probably seemed to all of us an interminable COVID lockdown of the last year and a half, it became increasingly evident the degree to which museum websites have become major sites of interface between audiences and art, serving as galleries, publications, and archives all in one. These websites have become places of record, stepping into and taking dominion over the long list of recording formats from annals to encyclopedias and newspapers that together describe a collective history of the present. Like some previous formats, these websites are constantly updated. But unlike previous formats, the websites hide the traces of their revisions, simultaneously appearing to bear the lightness of ephemera while accumulating the weight and gravitas of an infinitely expandable system of digital, cultural storage and memory. For architecture, a discipline that has attracted the attention of relatively few collecting institutions, the record produced by MoMA's website persists in its particular authority. So on this site, which I take as a record of the present, of thought generally as the present, we learn that there are 55 works by Cedric Price online, as opposed, just to give you a little bit of context, to the 1,811 works by Mies that are online, and the relatively small 29 by Marcel Breuer. We learn that Price, who's worth 55 points in this game, was a British architect who started his practice in 1960, who is best known for his interest in cybernetics and flexible space, interests that converged most famously in the unbuilt Fun Palace, a proposal for a media machine as much as for a building that staged and itself performed the dynamic actions that undergird the information environment. We also learned something about the historiography that shapes this view of Price. And if we just look at the exhibitions in which Price has been included, we see that there was almost no attention to his work during the period of the so-called Monument of the Fun Palace, but that there has been a significant uptick in interest during the past 10 years, a series of exhibitions in which he began to appear, culminating in the inclusion of almost every one of those 55 online works in the exhibition entitled Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age, in which Price's project Generator takes center stage in a historiography of architecture driven by technologies of digital informatics rather than industrial modes of standardization. Notions of digital informatics that, like MoMA's website itself, appear to be fluid rather than fixed, spatial rather than linear, and hence environmental, responsive, and adaptive. So Price was, of course, not alone in those interests in responsive adaptation to environmental change. In fact, they were already, by the 1960s, becoming as ubiquitous as computing itself has since become, from the Japanese metabolists who reimagine buildings as having the capacity to take in information about shifting patterns of use and use it to reorganize a building's cellular structure, to the so-called radical Italian architects who wanted to speed architecture up to the pace of fashion. This is just one of my favorite ones. This was a dress store in Milan. Dresses were hung above in these plastic tubes. Shoppers came along and controlled a computer below where they would punch in numbers of the things that they wanted to see and they would descend. So this is a constantly adapting digitally through a digital interface, a constantly adapting and therefore always au courant design, if you know what I mean. So there were the radicals like this, and even corporate architects like Anthony Lumsden, who conceived a building form as appropriately determined by what he called environmental fit, a process that would unfold in a building the way a plant grows, taking in information about sun and land slant and water, and converting that by an internal process of calculation into intelligent and intelligible form. So I am interested in Generator precisely because despite being utterly unoriginal in all of its broad strokes, it has nevertheless secured a leading position in this emerging canon of techno-environmental projects, and I would like to understand why. So I'll begin, in case you don't know the project, with a brief description of what Generator was supposed to have been, or rather with a brief rehashing of what Price thought Generator might have become. So this is his own publication on the project, which he described as a forest facility for 1 to 100 users. Architecture is used as an aid, and I'm quoting, you can read along with me, as an aid to the exhibition of one's interests, a series of structures, fittings, and components that respond to the appetites that they themselves may generate. A menu of items for individual and group demands of space, control, containment, and delight, a place to work, create, think, and stare. Timber frame structures with variable infills and cladding located on regular grid of concrete pads, continual movement and chain achieved by means of a pneumatic wheeled crane, seal in terms of systems, sealed waste, high-level electricity, and audio-visual links, as well as packaged air conditioners. So to translate this kind of architecture journal description, Generator is what was to have been, simply put, a space for performance and creative people to be in nature, where creative arts were less made than sort of thought about, to have been comprised of wooden huts in a garden setting, huts that provided shelter, power, and environmental controls, huts that could be picked up and moved around, and hence were amenable to infinite variation and responsiveness. The cubes were to sit on a grid of concrete pads that were themselves fixed, enabling the cubic hoods, as you see them here described, to move in response to a whole series of variables. In this particular drawing, the variation is the sun, so they could rotate in various dimensions and follow the sun in that way. The gesticulating performance of this person under the cube that's being moved around by a crane reveals the way in which the operation was conceived, not only to enable performers. So slightly later, when the project was actually given, the Cedric Price project was given up and it became the White Oak Dance Project, you can see that this was what they had in mind, right? So temporary performance spaces in the middle of this forest. One of the things that the client asked of Cedric was, you know, I really don't want anything, but there must be a grand piano, so you can see why. So it was designed to accommodate this kind of performance, but was itself always performing, changing location, changing its behavior, and so forth. So rather than fixed programs, Generator was actually populated by characters. One of the character was called Factor, and Factor was the crane operator who would be moving these little things around from here to there. That he could combine them together. It was a he, actually. It was the guy that took care of the lands, theoretically, who was cast in this lead role. They could rotate up and down. They could move from place to place along this grid, and they could be combined into 1, 2, 3, etc. The cubes were accompanied with some other elements, which I will tell you about in a moment. So Generator was conceived as responsive not only to environmental conditions like sun and wind, et cetera, but also to human activities. So rather than have a standard theatrical setup with a stage and a back room and a place to sleep, there are endless charts, these activity compatibility charts, where you could, under various circumstances, make a dot or a dash or whatever, and the whole thing was supposed to change accordingly. Now, to make sure that visitors who were out there, you know, thinking and staring, if you remember, he said, didn't get too complacent, Generator came also not just with Factor, but with another character named Polarizer. And Polarizer, it was none other than Barbara Jacobson, Cedric Price's girlfriend, by the way, at the moment, whose job, like an 18th century salonière, was to keep the architectural action happening. So lest you just sort of got comfy out there in the sun, she was supposed to come along and prickle you until you decided that you were done staring and picking your nose and would now want to do something else so that the whole thing would reconfigure. Price, you know, the fact that he felt that he needed this character evinces a kind of anxiety that people were not going to behave in as interesting a way as he wanted them to. And in fact, he was quite concerned that humans would generally not keep pace with the generator's capacity to change, that it would somehow be too much effort, too much work to do all this change. And so he asked John and Julia Fraser to serve as computational consultants. This is a new category of architectural consultant that began to emerge in this period, and asked them to develop a system for determining when Generator was getting boring and what to do about it, how to redesign the configuration accordingly. And voila, this is what they came up with. It included a kind of provocation code algorithm that was embedded in this chip, which would then turn around and reconfigure Generator, not only by recognizing that it was now boring and needed to change, but by producing drawings that would then instruct Factor and the others about how to make these changes, drawings that themselves, unlike typical architectural perspectives, could also be animated. Everything, in other words, was in motion, from the sun to the program, to the cubes, to the drawings themselves, and the feedback among these dynamic flows of energy generated an environment that came to be called already back in the day as the first intelligent building environment, and was conceived as one less designed in any typical sense than triggered by what Price called a, quote, perpetual architect. So the notion that interaction between a person and the environment should shape subjectivity, but also produce intelligence is an idea as old as Plato's Academy and the peripatetic philosophers who moved through its garden, encountering phenomena that required explanation and that hence generated intelligence. This tradition was famously reactivated in the British picturesque garden, conceived not in plan, as had been 17th century formal gardens, but in elevation. Vertically disposed elements like trees and rustic huts were deployed along meandering paths, acting as magnets, bringing viewers, mostly British landowners who had expanded their property through enclosure and improvements, bringing them along so they could take their rightful place as masters of the land. Propelled by similar visual attractors and desiring lines, visitors to Generator were also to recover from urban ennui among the trees and become their most creative selves. The pseudo-picturesque naturalism, the pseudo-naturalism of the picturesque was developed in tandem with theories of architecture that reduced buildings to the barest of minimal elements, trees that made a hut, a few wooden posts and a roof, and an image of architectural automaticity that eventually required complex machines to produce. So everybody towards the end of the 18th century and then throughout the course of the 19th century wanted to go from boring formal gardens to exciting, self-fulfilling, picturesque gardens. And there was one kind of problem with this, and that is that trees annoyingly take a long time to grow. And so they had to invent a whole bunch of machines to not only make nature, but make it appear at its fullest maturity in an instant. So Price's elemental wooden hut and visual screens made of trees that moved about by cranes created a garden of leisure where you were free to spend time, pick your nose, and listen to the radio. If you remember his dots, I think it's actually kind of cute that he imagined in the 1970s people were still listening to the radio. He was, for a techno geek, he was a little bit behind the times. So in this garden, the visitor found a place of comfort, if not among the landed gentry, then at least among the images that constituted the building blocks of contemporary subjects and the media environment in which they lived. So when you look to the lower right of this image, you see Price himself made, he's kind of a kind of post-Huber cyborg made out of bits and pieces of images. But it is the idea of the perpetual architect that is especially interesting. If here we see the architect becoming machinic, made out of mechanically reproduced and reconfigurable images, we see perpetuity, we understand perpetuity as something that itself cannot really be seen, but rather can only be promised. Because like the perpetual motion machine on which it is modeled, the perpetual architect is a hypothetical figure, one who can do infinite amounts of work without a visible energy source and without apparently any effort at all. So these absences cannot be seen, but the effect of the perpetual architect is visible in Price's production of an idealized consumer society, an infinitely sustainable world that never looks empty. I don't know if you can read his writing on these two drawings, but it says that in this world, it should never look empty and you should never feel full. That is to say, the perpetual architect is a fabrication that relies on the apparent capacity of the computer to automatically generate information to distract itself and us from consideration of the energy, labor, and resources that undergird its operations. In the case of generator, as is often the case, but here in more ways than you might expect, which I hope I'll have the time to tell you, the source of this techno-environmental fantasy, this wealth of images, as much wealth is sourced in the land. As you can see, back to the MoMA, our friendly MoMA website, the project was commissioned by Howard Gilman for a site at the Gilman Paper Corporation in the White Oak Plantation in Florida. This plantation is a large tract of land the Gilman family purchased in the 1930s, having, like many other manufacturers, moved their paper making factory from the north to the south, where land, labor, and trees were cheap. The factory was located just across the Florida border in St. Mary's, Georgia, and its dominion over the town and the land is visible even in tourist postcards. So if you look at the back horizon, that's the factory, smoke stacking its way across the land. John Margulies, who was a very well-known photographer of American roadside attractions, if any of you know the Venturi's work in roadside signs and so forth, almost all of those photographs were taken by this guy, John Margulies. This photo of Yulee, Florida, that's the name of the zone down there, gives a sense of both how isolated this area appeared, and an apartness and an out of sightness that turns out to have been fundamental to the business practices of such factories, because what happened in the South in these towns apparently just stayed there a little bit like Las Vegas. But if we look at his photos, we can begin to read certain things about this area. So local food, for example, such a great image of what you might see all over that part of the world. But let me give you a brief description taken from this period about what was happening to catfish and shrimp and crab. If you take a crab, a local fisherman said, and throw him in the river, you know what he'll do? Number one, he'll jump right out. And number two, he'll die. The air was worse. Even another description from the period, even the air in St. Mary's is poisoned. When the wind brings down plumes of caustic smoke, walls and windows are not enough. Gilman's smoke seeped into one man's garage and ate away the chrome window frames on his car. This same smoke settles on all the houses in towns and enters all the lungs. Parents report that often they cannot see their children playing across the yard for the air is too opaque. So this sign is not just old, it's bearing witness to the environmental effects of the local paper factory. It's also telling you a little something about the political history of this site with these colonial minute men. Here is a postcard of the White Oak Plantation that tells you that before the revolution, there was an English governor who first gave the land to Andrew Way in 1768, who then began to develop lumber, naval stores, rice, sugarcane, and cotton, which is to say, this is the moment that it became a plantation. And in fact, its most successful crop was rice. And if you zoom even further out, you see the white oak plantation on the left, or you see where generator, this is all the plantation on the south part of the river that you're looking at here. But what you see there is where the generator project would have been on the left. And what you see across the main body of the image are all the remaining traces of the rice plantations. If you were to zoom in even closer, you would see other square huts on concrete pads, the tabby houses made out of that kind of tabby concrete that's made with shells and so forth, that combined African and indigenous knowledge to produce these cubes for labor. If you were to look around over time and farther, you would understand that the reason that the factory was there was not only because of this history of falsely cheap labor, but because making paper requires wood, lots and lots of wood and lots of transformation of the land into sites like this. So by the time you get Cedric Price coming down here, the land has already been transformed. There's fewer and fewer white oak, more and more pine, more and more smoke, to the point that it became the kind of town that began to attract great deals of attention in the mass media. So here you're looking at an article that was published on St. Mary's, Georgia in the 1970s that describes the control over the town and the environment of the Gilman Paper Company. It's a kind of crazy series of stories, which I will not bore you with, but they include attempted murder for hire. The company was trying to control everything. Somebody wanted to unionize the labor, so there was an assassination for hire attempt. Another attempt was made to get rid of dissenters by a series of young women being paid to trump up charges of rape against a local doctor. It really became a kind of toxic on every level place that was run, interestingly, according to Harper's, according to the model of what they called, and I quote, the Yankee cult of the great executive. That is to say, somebody who owned the factory but lived in New York, a new, I'm quoting here, a new robber baron who feels that it's no one else's business how they run their town, as someone who holds tightly to the conviction of their right to tell the worker what to do, including how to vote and what to think. It was this kind of total control of environment, of people, of money, of law that led people like the Nader, Ralph Nader's group to go into these company towns and do these studies of the intersection between law, taxation, business, pollution, and so forth, this complex, what we would now call regulatory environment. And one of their books of the 1970s called The Water Lords focused on mill towns in Georgia in particular, including St. Mary's. Finally, this town in particular, which stands in for other kinds of towns, was the subject of a very elaborate expose on television on 60 Minutes. This is all to say that there is absolutely no way that in 1976, when Price started working on this, that he could not have known who he was dealing with. Every description of the smell of the site means that the moment you got out of a plane or a train or a car, your nose would have told you what you were dealing with. Nevertheless, Price's own view of the Gilman factory is literally straight out of the company brochure. Very spick and span, very clean, very monumental, a view of modern machinery shaped by a heroic image of the modern machine, celebrated in photography since the early part of the 20th century, celebrated not just by photography in general, but by photography of the kind that Gilman himself was collecting, and ended up with one of the greatest collections, what is called one of the greatest collections of photography of the 20th century. A collection that he was advised in the shaping of by none other than the polarizer herself and her colleague and ex-curator at the Museum of Modern Art. In fact, Gilman was so actively collecting that he wasn't noticing that by the late 1970s, the Gilman Paper Company was already in trouble, already in so much trouble that it would never have been able to pay for a generator. He was too busy collecting things like exotic animals to have on the site, exotic animals, exotic photographs, and exotic architects. Because one of the most important collections within the Museum of Modern Art is the works on paper collected for the Gilman Paper Company owner. So what was produced was a collection that now produces the Museum of Modern Art. So the connection between generator and the site is happening on so many levels, it's almost overwhelming. It builds the Gilman collection that is now the heart of the Museum of Modern Art architectural collection. It built the paper on which these works on paper. This is one of the last computer projects that is largely on paper made by the Gilman factory. These huts were to be made out of wood, dimensioned wood of the kind that when the paper factory started to get in financial trouble, they started to make instead dimensioned lumber and became the Gilman building material company. And this whole connection between the labor on the land in the South and the Yankee executor, Price drew it again and again, creating these totally insane composite maps where you have Florida and New York collapsed together. If you see in the center of the drawing, one of the blocks of New York, which is around the corner from the Museum of Modern Art, by the way, it's actually the Time Life building, which is of course where Gilman had his New York headquarters. So as try as they might to keep these two things apart, Price was well aware of the connection of these different geographies of wealth and knew that there was no visiting generator without seeing, even if only in the spectacle of your mind's eye, how they came together. Okay, so what else can we say now that we know, let's say, the backstory as quickly as possible when we go back to this land that we understand as a place from which wealth was extracted through these various mechanical systems of the perpetual architect. So Price actually begins with a pretty picturesque view of the site. This is one of the first things he did, and like a good British architect, he made a kind of pretty picture of a pretty site that looks something like this. And so I would like to spend my last couple of minutes here talking about the representation of work, how Price worked, how he represented work, and what the status of work in this new information environment might have been. So an architect's work often begins with a plan, or so it is said. So this is a plan. It's a pegboard where you can very vaguely see this almost childlike drawing sketched on the top. Pegboards are these fantastic things that you can plug things in and move things around. So it's not just a site, it's a kind of model, if you will, of infinite variation, a kind of anti-organization, if you will. Infinite variability and flexibility with the super ease of just moving a peg. I'm sorry that this is a bad photograph, but I'd like to call your attention to this note that is in the archive. It says, a plan is nothing unless it degenerates into work, which Price then goes on to say that this quote was on the office wall of Douglas Brooks, president of the Labor Council of Atlanta in the United States. Which is to say, Price is really thinking about work. I mean, what is he doing in the Labor Council's office of Atlanta? I haven't figured that out, but he's interested in work. And he's interested in this idea that a plan is nothing unless it degenerates into work. And in his typical critical manner, you can then imagine that what he has actually done is try to develop a non-plan that does not degenerate. A non-plan cannot degenerate because it's already degenerated. And what it does is generate leisure rather than degenerate into work. That was his principle. Now, it just so happens that that quote is not just any quote, but a bad quote, a misremembered quote by the leading business theorist of the post-war period, Peter Drucker. He's a kind of guru of business management who, amongst other things, not only came up with this idea that a good business plan is only a good intention unless it immediately degenerates into hard work, but he invented the very concept of the knowledge worker. In other words, of labor in the post-industrial age. So Generator works as a system of degenerating work into leisure, degenerating manual labor into knowledge labor that moves around in the following way. So this was a mock-up that they made on site. And rather than an image of anybody hard at work, everybody in these photographs of the mock-up are sitting around not doing much of anything except picking. I mean, when you look at it, it's kind of amazing. You're picking your nose, they're writing here, at least they're watching TV. That's good. They're taking a bath. It's really pretty much not much of anything. Okay, so what other things do plans do? Well, plans organize activities on the surface of the earth. They enable architects to decide what's important to show and what's not important to show. So here we have apparently the generator in its most elemental form, a simple piece of earth, a curvilinear path, some bits and pieces of nature, and a cube. Well, the site plan tells a slightly different story, however, because we have all of those things there, but we also have a couple of other things, the African bisons that are beginning to appear on the site at the bottom, but we also have what he calls slave ruins up at the top and a bothy over to the right, which is to say that Price not only understands the relationship of this site to New York, but he also understands the relationship of this site to its history of people who worked the land. This, in fact, are those ruins on the site at White Oak. When he begins to develop the plan, he converts the land in very good Jeffersonian fashion, I would add, into an all-over grid. So even the land outside the boundaries of the site proper are gridded so that he can lay out these concrete pads. And the one rectilinear thing that does not obey this logic is the one in towards the center with the X. When you go to the right-hand side, you see that the slave bothy is still there. Because his working method was designed to save him as much work as possible. So he always replicated drawings and used an underlay so that he could sort of as a time saver. Every time he replicated this drawing, the quote, slave bothy was repeated. It persists, it's part of the site, it remains visible until he has to move to a different kind of plan. When he moves to this plan, it's not just that certain things go away, it's that the labor and the history of the site goes away with them. At that point, and I would add that there's, and a kind of border gets emphasized, no longer the overall grid, but a bounded space, a kind of protected space where some things are in and some things are out. The grid now does not have to go over the land as a whole, it's implicit. The grid has been unified, it's no longer jagged across the path in the center, which is to say that this bounded, gridded space has become planned. It has become exactly the kind of plan that you would not have imagined he would have developed. And it becomes an all-over unifying plan of exactly the kind that is actually quite easy to adapt to the primitive computer-aided design that the Frasers were developing for him. At that point, any traces of the land, its surface, and the beings that lived on it are, of course, gone. So that's plan. In the picturesque garden, however, the principal mode of composition was not planned, but was in elevation. Parallax, the frontal view as things move through space, was the key device of the picturesque garden designer. And in fact, if his first mode of operating was through these repetitive plans, a second way of working, an aspect of his working method, was to work through frontally taken photographs like this one. And to insert, this is back to the other plan just for a moment, but just so that you see, he begins by taking the site and putting and introducing into the site these cones. And they are, in fact, cones of vision. The road is a cone of vision that enables the crane to move through it. But the real incredible moments are these, when he is just using stickers like the kind you buy in a stationery store and applying them directly to the surface of these Polaroids in order to construct the sense of a kind of penetrating vision through the site. These are the mock-ups of this Gilman 2x4s, the Gilman Building Company 2x4s, where he's making these little shelters that in effect operate like what you might call a pinhole camera, right? So they're little squares with screens that have holes in them, and the holes are used in order to produce images. And they produce images of a lot of people at leisure, sitting around. That's quite a large bottle of champagne on that table as they're hanging out here. The only person who's doing anything other than drinking and maybe picking their nose is somebody who's taking more photographs. I would just, again, remind you that cones of vision, penetrating cones of vision, are also a trope of this period. But if we compare the cone of vision, say, to Matta Clark's, here we see work rather than leisure on view. So the working method, like in elevation, is just like the one in plan, an iterative process that relies on image replication. So a photo is made, the photo is Xeroxed, the Xeroxed is then repeated and worked on. So design happens actually on the image itself, the image operating as if it were a screen, that you would move things around, these design elements that can be added, just like the MoMA website, that can be added or taken away, infinitely varied, without leaving any trace. And he does all of this using the tools of an office manager, Xerox stickers and computers and so forth, really quite unlike the kinds of working drawings typically associated with architects who build. Now, even though he thought of this as a place of not work, what I'm trying to suggest is that actually it's exactly a place of work, a place of post-industrial knowledge work. So you're looking here at the plans of Action Office, which, just like Generator, was based on the idea that things had to move around all the time, that the world became static if world and work became static and unproductive if things were not always in circulation. So in Active Office, all the furniture got put on wheels. Walls were gotten rid of. Instead of walls, you had screens. Screens were not for privacy in particular, but screens were places where people would put their paperwork, stick up the images of their work, because the theory of Action Office is that what might end up in the trash in one office might be seized upon as knowledge, useful knowledge, by somebody else. So instead of putting your paperwork in the drawer, you put it on your tackable surface so that knowledge was always in circulation, and in circulation, new wealth and knowledge could be generated. This is the first model of the creative office based on the circulation of information and deployed by the knowledge worker. This is Generator avant la lettre. And not only are they the same in the way they operate in the world, their mode of being produced is also the same. So Action Office was not just a set of elements like a hut and a screen, but it was a way of working. And it came along with instructions to office managers to build little models, to work with photograph and elevation, and of course, to use computers to enable the office manager to organize and reorganize ad infinitum the work environment. And just to be clear, just to make it so that this was as easy as possible, Herman Miller invented the templates for their own office equipment so that this office manager could draw all the parts exactly and to scale. So the office manager, in fact, was an architect, had become an architect, not just an architect, but a perpetual architect for whom everything, including drawing, was easy. Okay, so Generator is an Action Office populated by knowledge worker who is made of bits and pieces of movable images, infinitely flexible, who contributes through this design to the idea that all of this wealth, all of this generated wealth is made without labor, without resources, without energy, or without anything that feels at all like it could be work. This image of the knowledge worker, you see the tree stamps, he used stamps, you just basically, for anybody who's old enough will remember charrette and the sort of stationery stores of the period where you would go and there was a kind of pornography of stationery elements, and you would just buy those and become an architect, and if you had the right rapidograph pen or something like that. And this guy here on the right, that's in the Architectural Review, selling these graphic effects. This guy standing there in the library, this is sort of the new, not just the architect who's the guy standing in the library, but actually it's the architect, the office manager, the curator, the museum director, and the collector, all of these folks who are knowledge workers. So Cedric Price didn't invent any of this stuff, but he did seem to offer a model that was a kind of compromise between the information and sort of revolution that would, in the hands of corporate architects like Bertram Goldberg here, if you see, replace human effort altogether. So that's one model, just replace human effort. And then on the other hand, you have the model of somebody like Aldo Rossi and all of those guys who were almost fetishistically resisting new technologies by hanging on to handwork as much as they possibly could. So to finish up back to our museum websites, I take you back to 1977 here to the drawings of Aldo Rossi that you just saw on the walls of the Leo Castelli Gallery in 1977 in an exhibition precisely put together by Barbara Jacobson, the polarizer of the generator, the girlfriend of Cedric Price, the one who was trying to generate work for her friends like Cedric Price. The thing that I want to call your attention to is that Cedric Price really did not understand the new work economy that was being born right then in the late 1970s. This is a letter that Barbara wrote to Cedric explaining how much money all these guys were now making by selling their drawings in art galleries. I heard that Michael Graves cleared 60 grand from the most recent exhibition. You'd have to quick do the math to figure that out. Oh, you can't really see this. So he more or less writes back to the gallery and complains about their fees, saying, under the heading of architecture fees, I should point out that this office never charges less than 25% of the fee for design and production of a single house. In relation to the gallery's commission of 25% of the architect's fees, this would have to be added to my fee of 25% and not subtracted. So here he is being asked to give drawings to a drawing show, and the poor man simply has not understood that what's being sold are the drawings, not his service and labor as an architect, which is completely irrelevant to this new economy of perpetually moving pieces of paper. Of course, somebody like Eisenman, understood this extremely well. This is another one of the Castelli shows, and went to extraordinarily inventive measures to make sure that people understood how much work was invested in these images. I mean, when was the last time you saw an axonometric that was so intensive that you had to put a stanchion around it, in case you might bump into it? Cedric Price understood that by this time, 1980, you couldn't really properly be in an exhibition without at least one axonometric. But in his regular sort of fuck off to the architecture world, his axonometric was produced by hanging a mirror at a 45-degree angle over a very conventional model. It's the simplest, the least effortful way to make an axonometric that you can imagine. And in addition, it is infinitely variable, because if you tilt the mirror in any direction, you can have an infinite number of axonometric views all drawn at different angles. So there is an enormous amount of knowledge work, if you will, put into this thing to make it appear to be without work at all. But of course, you know, all these work, all this automatic work, all this money doesn't in fact grow on trees. It grows out of trees. And if these automatically generated, infinitely variable trees were the ones that Cedric Price had in mind, we do have to remember, it is our obligation to remember the slash pines that he saw and that he knew on the plantation had been planted by underpaid and poisoned workers. So today, where does that leave us? And why is Cedric Price the kind of poster child for the inconsequentiality of this idea of infinite wealth without labor? So the one thing that we do see in this connection between Jacobson and the collection and the Museum of Modern Art and the new architect's fees and the knowledge economy was that, in fact, the gallery and its maintainers were the new patrons of architecture. And they continue to be just that. And that the producers of these spaces, curators, museum directors, et cetera, are the new perpetual architects. So if you look here at this exhibition that was at the Venice Biennale in 1914, you are looking at a room devoted to the works of Cedric Price, where it makes absolutely perfect sense that, like Action Office, nothing is on the walls, but everything is deployed on movable tables that come in and go out, that generate conversation around them. They also understand that all of these things come from an archive. The archive is now also on display, an archive made just the way Cedric Price made his drawings, out of an endless series of reproductions. I don't know if anybody there has been to the Venice Biennale, but it's always hot and sweaty, and nobody's going to put any original piece of paper there. So Hans Ulrich Obrist made a paper replica of the entire archive of Cedric Price and Lucien Burckhardt. And the archive is set up in this beautifully designed display by Herzog Demeron. And folks that worked probably for free, interns, would pull out boxes and skate them out into the room on these movable things around which people would have conversations. So this endlessly circling, endlessly remixed, perfectly reused, renewed, recycled reality of infinite variation without cost is really most at home and most visible in the websites of our contemporary museum institutions. And as much work as they succeed in doing, in making us think that this circulation of knowledge is as light and easy as the airbrushed pixels of green that we see here in Cedric Price's generator, it is still possible to see the impact of this conflation of wealth, labor, and culture and the impact it still has on the site of St. Mary's. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sylvia. That's lots of issues there. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Balmer and his students, who will ask a few questions. And so go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, Sylvia, or should I say Dr. Laban. Hi, Sylvia, fantastic lecture. I'll be thinking about it for a long time, as I have about the amazing lecture that you gave here in 2017. I was lucky enough to be in the room with many of my colleagues and a lot of students. And I would describe the sort of the atmosphere in that room as electrifying. It's one of the finest lectures I certainly have ever attended. So it was a great honor to be asked to sort of work with a handful of my students to prepare some questions for you. And I think it's appropriate that you started the lecture by talking about the significance and the impact of museum websites, because in addition to us reading several of your recent lectures, I directed my students to sort of look at some of the exhibition websites that you've been responsible for, in the past few years, including two incredible videos hosted by the CCA in connection with your exhibition there in 2018. One in the more traditional sort of mode of lecture, in-person lecture, because of course this is pre-COVID. I know there were people in the audience because you referred to Peter Eisenman being in the second row during that talk. But and then a second video where you're basically talking to the camera, and I found that a particularly effective format for an online environment. So, and toward that, my question is really prefaced by two really beautifully sort of on message quotes that you give toward the beginning of that. I think what the CCA calls a discussion with Sylvia Laban. And the quotes are really pertinent to the sort of thesis of the exhibition and of much of your recent research. The first quote is, "The age-old problem of defining architecture became urgent by the 1960s. On the one hand, people who were attempting to dismantle architecture and turn it into a social practice," and I'll ask in a moment whether we would include Cedric Price in that group. And on the other hand, there were people who were trying to create overinflated monuments to self-importance. Second quote is really the sort of thesis statement of the exhibition. "Architecture itself is a mechanism, a machine for filtering out that which doesn't belong to your own definition of the field." So my question is, in your opinion, was Cedric Price's effort to move architecture towards a social practice, if indeed that's what his practice was about, was that also by definition a mechanism for filtering out whatever else he felt didn't belong to his definition of the field? Was it inclusive or was it exclusive?
So Barbara Jacobson, who obviously knew him well, uses this fabulous French idea to describe Cedric, which is pense à gauche, vive à droite.
Okay. Yeah.
Think to the left, but live to the right.
Right.
So he was a guy who loved the high life and loved moving in high-end cultural circles and always had an expensive cigar and good booze, et cetera, but talked a lot about the working class. So, I think that this is a problem of the political economy of modernity right there. So I can't really say either or, but both. I guess maybe to clarify what I was saying in that comment was up to a point, I would say, before the Second World War, there was more or less agreement on what architecture was and what it should do. There was lots of disagreement about how to best do it, but there was agreement that architecture and buildings were kind of isomorphic. They were not exactly the same, but that the goal of architecture was to produce good buildings. And good buildings had something to do with using material, with using money and time in a relatively efficient and socially meaningful way. I don't think anybody would have much disagreed with that. There might have been a difference of opinion about what socially meaningful meant. Are you, what sort of class are you talking about, et cetera. But I don't think there would have been that many people before the Second World War who would have said things like, architecture isn't about building, it's about ideas. Architecture isn't about materials, it's about drawings. Architecture isn't about the social, it's about self-expression. I mean, they might have thought both but I don't think so. And I also don't think that they would have said that the job of the architect is to make people happy. It would maybe to house people, to make them more comfortable, equally fantasy kinds of things. I'm not saying that some were true, before the war it was true and after the war it was not true. I'm just saying that the conditions really changed. And the idea that architecture, in effect, that architecture had succeeded in mastering the capabilities of modern industrial production, to the point that now it could take on other things like self-expression, like happiness. And that created a set of expectations for everybody that utterly lacked metrics.
Right.
Who's going to say self-expression? I mean, I can go to a housing project and I can measure how many people get to live here who before were not getting to live there, let's say, right? And whether it's a small number or a big number, I can establish some kind of empirical set of metrics for understanding that. I think that essentially the wealth, particularly in the United States, after the Second World War, created a situation in which those metrics disappeared. And architecture, the very definition of architecture, became open to debate and open to ideological conflict, and so forth. And what I would say about Price is that he is fully aware that that's the debate and is trying to find his way through that debate and these crazy moments in which he is showing up at Leo Castelli's with basically working drawings in a tube. Yeah. Is an indication that he's not understanding the new program. And insofar as he's not understanding the new program, then I would say he was operating in a kind of modernist paradigm, that what the architect did was build stuff, and the instruments of architecture were the things that helped you build stuff. And his values were build it with as much flexibility and openness as possible. That I think that's the best I can answer that question.
That is more than sufficient. Thank you so much, Sylvia. That is fantastic. So I think I had suggested to Meg that she might want to start off with the next question. Meg, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Meg.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Laban, for speaking and for virtually visiting Charlotte. So I guess just to start, to prepare for your lecture, and then when I was asked to be one of the student panelists, I read your tree speech that was recently published in Log about the Italian environmentalism in the 1960s and 70s. And I really took note of your description of the tree as an example of the architecture of the sign. And then you also mentioned in your lecture how the process of design for Cedric Price occurred on the image itself, using tools like the Xerox machine and like the stickers that's accompanying, tools. So my question is, I think, the graphic technologies of the 1960s and 70s, namely xerography, are pretty much obsolete, in light of the digital tools that we use today. So how would you describe the role of these like reproducible signs, like the tree, as they've shifted through these methods of design from xerography to digital means of production?
Well, I'm sure should be asking you that question, because I don't know enough about CAD blocks and exactly how they operate and so forth. I'm sure that you do. I do know, however, that there is a kind of industry of tree makers, digital tree makers out there in the world. And that if you want a certain kind of tree that's very particular, for which there is not already a CAD block, there are one woman in particular who I think works like in San Fernando Valley, that if you send her a few pictures of something, she will turn around and in a week send you back a personalized CAD block of those trees in plan and elevation at various scales and so forth. So, so there is a kind of automatic personalization of the redesign of trees that is happening through these digital, and they're not just digital interfaces. I mean, I think it's incredibly interesting that making trees digitally turns out to be part of a kind of bespoke individual industry, right? So it's not all one or the other, and the interface there is super interesting. I guess I would ask something that I didn't get a chance to talk about here or in the tree speech one in particular, but something that plant historians think about and that I find completely fascinating is also the question in reverse, which is how does the way that you represent a tree or whatever plant, how does it in turn affect how plants grow in the world? So, for example, one thing that folks study is the history of the invention of the idea of invasive species. So think eucalyptus trees in California, or I'm sure you've got your own version of invasive species around you. So invasive species are very rarely in the modern world species that invaded. Mostly invasive species are species that were brought in for one reason or another. And over time, conditions change. One of the conditions being visual, and trees or plants that used to be beautiful start to be seen as less attractive. One study, I know we have to end soon, but I just get wrapped into these details. So I'm just going to give you this little story because I just find it so fascinating. So Scotland, we're going to Scotland now, where in the 18th century, they became fascinated with the picturesque. They wanted a Scottish picturesque, so it needed to be rugged and hard and rocky, like the Scottish landscape. So they imported, Britain here is colonizing all over the world. They import these Rhodesian something, I can't remember exactly which plant, and they start growing and they're rocky and picturesque and fantastic and everybody loves them. Okay, then by the end of the 18th century, the Scottish landowners are going broke. They're getting driven out by the British. They can't maintain their lands anymore. So all of those beautiful picturesque gardens, which actually take an army of farmers picking every leaf to make it do this and that, start to get abandoned, and everything, including these Rhodesian plants, become overgrown. In the early 20th century, when people start going back to Scotland, they're coming now with their little cameras, their little Instamatics, and they're taking pictures of everything. And those damn plants are too many, and they cast shadows, and they make bad pictures. They make bad photographs. And it's only when they present themselves poorly to this new angle of vision created by the camera that they get redefined as invasive species and start getting cut down left and right. So becoming classified as invasive, which happened when the plant no longer met cultural aesthetic norms, cost, if you want to put it in dramatic terms, cost those plants their lives, right? So the way we see a plant, which is shaped by how we represent the plants to ourselves, has a huge role to play in the life expectancy of one species or another. So I think that we could talk about how trees are appearing and other plants are appearing in CAD, and then we would also need to talk about how is CAD affecting the way we grow and think about trees and plants in the world. It's a roundabout answer to your question, but that's what I think. Good question.
Fantastic. Great question. Great response. I would just add that when I came across your mention of Leonardo and Staggi's book on trees, I was really excited because that's been my sort of post xerography approach to trees is to buy the book, scan all of the enormous drawings, and upload them to the Google Drive in the hopes that my students will, somehow digitally Xerox them into their own drawings. Next, Cami, are you ready?
Yes,
Okay.
I am ready. It is a pleasure to be able to talk with you, Dr. Lavin. In your recent essay titled Tree Speech, you describe how xerography was extremely helpful for working within the ambiente of the historic city of Florence and many other projects from Aldo Rossi. Do you think trees are becoming an incipient sign for modern urbanism since they are overly reproduced through our phones, tablets, and computer screens? Or did the media never matter to portray how trees are not beings, but only signs?
Well, I guess, it's interesting that you guys are focusing on this in particular. I think that I would go back a little bit to the previous question and say that it's really interesting to think about the dynamic between trees as they live in the world, let's say, and trees as they live in the semiosphere. Because, so maybe some of you have this, like I have on my phone, a handy dandy little app, because actually I know kind of not very much about trees. And so I have to have a little app that I can take out in the world and point it at a tree so that it will tell me what species it is. And facial recognition software turns out to be more effective with trees than it is for faces. And there are lots of reasons for that. And I'm actually involved in a research project to see if we can train a computer algorithm to learn to recognize trees in drawings rather than photographs. And that's turns out to be a very tricky thing to do. So all of your questions, I would say there needs to be a preliminary question, which is, what does a computer think a tree is? And that's very hard, because they don't think what it is the way we think that it is, and that's a big issue. But I guess I would ask you to think about, or ask myself to think about, right now in the last little while, there's more conversation about the need to regrow urban forests than there has been since forever. right? There were forests, and then they were down and then up, and so forth. So the relationship between trees and urbanism, between trees and environmental justice. I mean, I'm sure, you can't turn on the news without understanding the correlation between race, poverty, COVID, and trees, and hot and cold, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge amount of attention to that, and a huge amount of attention to how to develop the capacity to grow enough trees. Because of course, the neighborhoods that need the trees the most are the ones that can't afford a gardener, that can't afford to take time off from work to water things for the first 6 weeks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it would be interesting to ask where does this interest in urban forests come from? Where is this idea that trees should be all around us? Where does that come from? Because there have been earlier moments of thinking about forestation and deforestation and reforestation, and those conversations are almost always about way far away in the Amazon. So in the last couple of years, the discussion around trees has returned to the metropole. It's back in the city. It's back where all the iPhones are. I don't know how else to put it, right? So the hunt for trees that I can do on my phone is now also generating an interest in having actual trees around places where if you mapped it, you'd have very high clusters, not of trees, but of phones, so that are capable of seeing trees. So those dynamics, I think, are super interesting. And maybe because unlike the 70s, that was really fixated on image culture, still image culture, we now live in a social media environment where it's never just the image, but it's how it circulates through these platforms and so on and so forth. So that, I think that's a different kind of question. So it's a different situation. Therefore, we would have to ask the question about the relationship between trees and images in a way that captures that dynamic. But it's a great tree. And by the way, I do all my work in the car too.
My apologies. My mother was getting her citizenship and I was driving her.
Oh, congratulations.
Yay!
Exciting. So thanks, Cami. Thanks again, Sylvia. Before I turn it over to Luca for the final question from the panelists, I want to remind everybody in the audience that if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and Peter or I will read them aloud. Peter, I'll let you curate the questions as they come in, perhaps. So without further ado, Luca.
Hey, Sylvia. Thank you for coming to lecture. It was a quite exquisite lecture. So I recall you talking previously about Stanley Tigerman's Titanic collage and finding the glue marks in the rough paper edge around the cutout of Crown Hall when you blew it up to the mural size at your exhibition at the CCA, and how that started to change the perception and raise questions about these postmodern material practices. And then shifting to the largely earlier computational work and representation practices of Cedric Price, and then all the way to our present moment of full-blown, largely digitized practices of architecture. So when future historians look back at this largely digital practice of architecture, I'm wondering what may be that equivalent to the glue mark or the paper edge that historians may find when examining these largely digital materials in today's practice of architecture?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, I mean, really, probably the honest truth is I have no idea, because telling the future is really, really hard. It's a kind of, that's a game that you can only fail at. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think some people are going to say it's in the code, that there will be code things, and maybe it will be code things. I mean, I suppose I was about to say, well, becoming interested in code is maybe being interested in like the lead in a pencil. But of course, I don't know. I actually just did a little bit of research on this guy who, of course, invented the lead pencil. And not only invented the lead pencil, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say invented the first computer-aided design program in the late 18th century, because he invented this machine for drawing the sky that was essentially an engraving machine that drew lines. And you could vary the lines in an engraving. You could vary how much they were spaced and how deep the impression on an etching stone they made, so that automatically, let's call it parametrically, algorithmically, you could make it stormy or not stormy by changing these variables, and created a situation in which a kind of standard engraving that would have taken something like 3 months. This is what this guy calculated, that it would have taken 3 months to produce an engraving with this machine you could do in a day. So, I mean, it's a really deeply radical change. And the fact that the guy who invented the lead pencil also, you know, I mean, he was not an architect. Anyway, so it could be in the code. You know, in other words, it could be in things that we now think of as boring and invisible and who cares, but maybe are interesting. You know, I don't know, my most of the architects I know don't code. That's the one problem with going to code, is that most of the architects buy software and they don't actually do code. So there might be glitches in the code. There might be interesting problems of interface between code and architect, but maybe not on the level of code. The only other thing, yes, Piranesi would have loved the engraving algorithm, but the problem with Piranesi was that he was too much of an artist and not an inventor. And so he wasn't making engraving machines. He was just making the engraving. And that's really the difference between, you know, 1730 and 1780. The world had really changed then. So again, instead of predicting the future, I'm going to just see if I can answer your question with one historical anecdote. So Apple, way back in the day, way back in the Lisa Draw day, which is not only before you, but practically before me. So that's like really, really, really long ago, was looking to expand its market. And it thought architects who are known to be technology friendly, that's what they thought. This is literally what the internal papers of Apple say. Architects like technology. Maybe we can convince them that this software will be good for them. And what we're gonna tell them is that these architects are visual. So we're gonna give them a tool through which they can do their bookkeeping by clicking on a screen. So Lisa was a program developed for architects, but not to do what we might call architectural work, but to do their bookkeeping in a way that was acceptable to architects who were basically too right brain, I don't remember which it is, right brain, left brain, to be able to use like a double ledger accounting software or accounting book. So Apple West Coast, they looked around at some West Coast architects. One of them was Mark Mack, who was still then in the Bay Area. That was a kind of easy, low-hanging fruit. And another was Tom Main, a little farther away, but Morphosis wasn't that far. And there were like 3 or 4 firms. And most of them, like all four except one, said, well, this is just really dull and boring. I'm faster at doing the math for my bookkeeping with a calculator, so no thank you, Apple. Tom Bain, on the other hand, was like, okay, I don't know anything about bookkeeping. I don't do bookkeeping. I have a bookkeeper who does bookkeeping. Why do I need bookkeeping software? But maybe there's something weird that I could do with this. And actually, a student at UCLA doing research in the Main Archive came across this, essentially the very first computer-generated drawing that Morphosis made. And what's interesting about it is that it is not CAD. It is not a program-based thing. It is a drag and drop. Lisa was a drag and drop program made to drag numbers from one place to the other. And what Tom did was drag images of old-fashioned machines and drop them around on a site. And out of that came the Sixth Street house, which is made out of these crazy machines and pulleys and so forth. So I guess what you know, I don't know the future, but it may well be. I mean, we know that Gary uses aeronautic, you know, the question is, what kind of technology transfers has the computer made possible? And what kinds of errors and inventions do those transfers make possible? Those, I think, are going to be super interesting. Those are going to be super interesting. I hope that's an answer.
That is a very good answer. That's a curatorial answer. And I'd like to go into that. I know we're over time, and Greer is scolding me with that kind of red text in the chat session. Sylvia, it's wonderful to have you here again. Jeff and the students, thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia.
Yes, thank you very much, Sylvia.
It was really my pleasure, and I'm very sorry not to be there in person. And I really do have to go look at some tree things down in your neck of the woods.
Oh yeah.
So please do invite me again, and as soon as I don't know, maybe I'll go get my booster shot on Monday and get over this or whatever. But as soon as possible, I'd love to come and visit you in person, and we can go with my little Seek app and look at trees around you.
I'll start working on a tree tour right now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good.
And thank you, students, for your really excellent and very thought-provoking questions. Bye-bye.